Thank you for inviting me to speak at the conference today. The deconstruction of authenticity in the Chinese context is an especially challenging inquiry. It inevitably involves an association and connection to a reverence for the past, a valorization of the works of long dead masters and dynasties, of lineages of artists whose much admired achievements one might attempt to create in the present through tracings of the original works, freehand copies, reproductions, or forgeries. Archaizing works by Song, Ming, and other dynastic masters, as well as modern artists, create problems of indistinguishability, which are well-known features of the Chinese artistic canon, and which have resulted in many debates between scholars. The tangible and intangible connections, like a warp and weft of difference, create a complex tapestry of interactions and associations with Chinese cultural objects and sites. Some scholars, such as Handler, have viewed authenticity as a modern cultural construct related to ideas of individualism, a sympathetic view that tends to leave antiquarianism without its connoissorial foundations. Authenticity can be viewed as fragmented, contested, and performative. It is fragmented because instead of representing a unified inherent quality, it resides in multiple sources. In the field of art, the fragmentation stretches across and between the disciplines involved. It is contested because it is debated in academic discourse, implicated in ideological constructions, and the politics of signification. It is performative because, as an aesthetic construct, it is a thread in the relationship between production and aesthetic object, its context, and its reception. These are important facets of our approach to authenticity in contemporary hermeneutics. We have to remind ourselves, however, that authentication is a necessary component of the material authenticity of works of art. The Chinese were among the first to leave written accounts of the problems of assessing the authenticity of calligraphy and works of art in bronze, or paintings or scrolls on paper or silk. Not only authenticity became an important consideration, but also inauthenticity. For example, a 10th century Song dynasty scroll discusses the faking of archaic bronzes, while two Ming dynasty manuscripts provide detailed chemical recipes to replicate the surface appearance of ancient bronzes in an attempt to create the genuine aura of excavated bronze vessels. Fine excavated bronzes were much admired by the Song connoisseur, who would be able to differentiate between natural patterns of burial origin and artificial patterns concocted by Chinese alchemists as ersatz productions, or in tribute to the aesthetic of material degradation, the noble patina of reverential age. A well-known hanging scroll by Jin Enjoying Antiquities from the Ming dynasty shows two scholars carefully examining bronzes, which were even then over 1,000 years old. One of several depictions of the evaluation, authentication, and reverence for antiquities, which was already well established by the Tang dynasty. By the Ming dynasty, scholars had to be careful to acquire the connoisseurship needed in order to be able to distinguish between hanging scrolls hundreds of years old and those made last week, or between Shang dynasty bronzes and copies of them made in the Song, or more recently by highly skilled forgers. In that sense, material authenticity in the Chinese context has been of concern for hundreds of years at least, not only in a mimetic sense, but also in the recreation or creation of works which honor the achievements of long distant dynasties. Du Jing's work is particularly relevant to our talk today because the famous collector C.C. Wang stated that his work was representative in a collection of 1 in 100 of Du Jing's works, namely that it is authentic while the rest are not. Dr. Stephen Little, in a lecture from 2016, has remarked that the figure is closer to 1 in 1,000, and that every collection of Chinese art probably contains works attributed to Du Jing that are not by him at all. The aura of being in an admired collection supervenes on the material authenticity of the work of art as far as the perceptual properties of that work are concerned. In 2011, a painting by the 19th and 20th century master Qi by Xi sold for 65 million, but has since become entangled in debates concerning its authenticity. Zhong Linlan and Ling Xinglong, researchers at the Shanghai Museum, argued that the scroll had been traced from an original, while Shan Gulin judged the brushwork to be wrong. Qi by Xi has become so famous that forgeries of his work are common, while the monetary value of his work continues to escalate. In 2017, one of his artworks sold for $140 million, placing him in that exclusive club of artists whose work has sold for over 100 million. Qi is estimated to have produced between 8,000 to 15,000 works. However, auction houses have attempted to sell more than 18,000 works attributed to him. The confusion between aesthetic evaluation, material composition, historical association, scholarly appraisal, and authenticity of Qi's works is a perfect example of the problems in getting to grips with the conceptualization of authenticity in Chinese art. Understanding authenticity opens up a complex field of interrelationships, which encompasses the conceptual distance from intangible cultural heritage, especially relevant in the discourse on tourism and East Asian cultural property studies of temples and monuments, to the purist or logical positive concept of material authenticity prevalent in museum evaluations and auction houses of what constitutes an authentic Chinese artifact, which these two collectors may well have been concerned with. What we deem to be genuine or fake is not an objective determination, the blurb for this conference states, but something that we agree upon as communities. In the postmodern world of shifting relevance of art and artifacts, especially of indigenous communities, existential authenticity, individual or group instantiated, becomes an important consideration qua authentic status. The first international heritage charter that promulgated this recognition was the Nara document on authenticity, which sought to encompass East Asian restorations or rebuilding of certain shrines within the scope of World Heritage Guidelines, which had previously been excluded from the canonization of the authentic. This recognition of the intangible seemed long overdue, since it is hardly a modern phenomenon, being part of the ancient world's regard for relics and other saintly associations of materiality even if that materiality is not materially or authentic, an intangibility well discussed by Linnaean for the medieval period in his seminal book on art forgery. Even in terms of things like that, materiality may not be a definitive boundary between the genuine and the fake. The recreation of bronze mirrors in later epochs or their adaptive reuse in Buddhist religious imagery does not necessarily mean that these later instantiations are fundamentally inauthentic. Buddhist monasteries, of course, would preserve objects from earlier epochs for veneration as objects of scholarly study or for the regalian age value of them. Because of the conceptual trouble caused by the inclusion of the word authenticity, a later cultural accord, the Yamato Declaration, stated that authenticity is irrelevant in its relation to intangible cultural heritage, particularly when living communities are being discussed. Part of the reason for this is the need for communities to reinterpret their own past to provide a culturally relevant nexus in the present, which may be quite different from the demands on that cultural heritage 100 years ago. Despite the Yamato Accord, it is still viable to encompass intangible notions of validation within an analysis of authenticity. In fact, the Ho-An Protocols of 2009 go a long way to providing a comprehensive list of attributes that authentic cultural relics or sites may possess. These international or national cultural heritage documents have readdressed the balance between the older logical positive concepts of the legitimacy of cultural artifacts and the need to incorporate indigenous or ethnically diverse viewpoints in the assessment of what is meant by authenticity. Of course, we still have to evaluate the degree to which it is necessary to confront the problems of authenticity of paintings, pottery, scrolls, and metallic works of art. A useful way to think of authenticity here is to dissect the tapestry of the argument between three principal fields, which comprise material authenticity, conceptual authenticity, and aesthetic or historical authenticity. A work which has a conceptual authenticity may be materially evanescent, or a work aesthetically authentic may not possess the materiality of an original, but has become a representative of the real over the course of time. Bronze mirrors may provide an example of the latter, since molds could easily be taken from the originals to cast another bronze version, sometimes for scholarly contemplation, which reproduces all essential details of the original. I say essential because in terms of materiality, we can often determine that the patina, composition, or metallographic structure of the later product does not conform with the expected characteristics of the original, but nonetheless has become a collectible work of art as an authentic object in itself. We also have to consider the question of intentionality. To what extent does the intention of the artist constitute the basis of judging whether something is authentic or not? Does the perceived intentionality supervene on the consciousness of the observer's deliberations about the work? The famous problem of the intentional fallacy, originally posed by Wimsatt and Beardsley, is potentially relevant to our deliberations here. Was the intention of the copyist to produce something that she would use for scholarly research, or was it produced with the intention to pass it off as the original or one of the originals for financial gain? We can only surmise as to the intention of our historical case study here, apropos of the bronze mirror problem. The mirror in question, made 300 years ago, possesses an aesthetic or historical authenticity without actually being an original Warring States instance of the work. The extent to which the material authenticity of the work matters is not merely an academic exercise in chemical and metallographic contexts, but is one which has to be understood in terms of the artistic canon of Chinese art, in its diachronic longevity and revered lineages of production. We can apply the same logic to one of the most famous works of Chinese calligraphy, the classic of the Yellow Court. And this is only known from ink rubbings made in the 11th century AD. This Tang tradition even resulted in paintings being carved or engraved into stone, from which multiple ink squeeze rubbings were made. Similarly, the preface to the Orchid Pavilion gathering of 353 AD included the much admired calligraphy of Wang Zizi, which is probably buried with one of the Tang dynasty emperors and is only known from copies made by Feng Shensu from 627 AD in the Palace Museum, Beijing. But of course, it is only a copy, so there is no point in trying to determine the material authenticity of this preface to the Orchid Pavilion gathering. We can accord the copies an historical importance as preserving the iconic vestiges of an original, long since lost or buried, which we can valorize as an example of historical and aesthetic authenticity. In terms of material authenticity, there is no appropriate point of reference in these cases, apart from ensuring that the copy itself has not been further copied or forged. And the Chinese have four principal words for copying, all meaning different aspects of this activity. Thus, Mo refers to tracing copies, which are often the most difficult to discern from originals. Lu is a freehand copy of a work. Fang refers to works of mimesis, appropriation, or deceptive copying, while Zhao sometimes refers to works which are forgeries or fakes. Because of the importance in China for the transmission of earlier cultural achievements, the terms for copying are more carefully set out here than in the West and have greater applicability. In contemporary practice, there are artists such as Zhang Daquian or Zhang Daquian, whose motivations span the entire gamut of traditional Chinese painting, from the copying of a work by the hand master Badashanran, which Zhang states was produced by him as a copy, to wholesale forgeries, from which Zhang profited to the extent of about $10 million. An earlier scholar, Lu Zhenhu, was also responsible for dubious attributions and possible forgeries, but lacked the sophistication of Zhang, an artist who sought out ancient paper or scroll, who produced exact copies of historical seals, researched seal paste, used the correct calligraphy, and simulated natural degradation. Chinese works of art on paper or silk hundreds of years old display different mechanisms of degradation, and this evidence is frequently revealed on the reverse of the scroll. Cracks, delaminations, embrittlement, mold infection, or insect damage often result in a myriad of repairs. These restorations, sometimes involving hundreds of discrete repairs to the back of hanging scrolls on paper, are testimony to the historical authenticity of the work, although here Zhang attempted to circumvent that natural degradation by tearing some of his work into squares to be integrally restored to simulate historical deterioration. Even the terminus post quem date of introduction of one of Zhang's pigment lies in the 19th century, but it is possible to argue that these are restored areas of an original work rather than restorations of a fake, and therefore perfectly acceptable. The work of Zhang led to an entire conference at the Metropolitan Museum in 1999 concerning his work of Along the Riverbank, supposedly painted by Dong Yang of the Southern Tang court around 930 AD. Cahill, Kohara, and Li all regarded the work as a forgery by Zhang, while Shi and Fong held that Cahill had misinterpreted the visual evidence and the work is in fact authentic. Connoisseurship in relation to Chinese art and its various instantiations seems preoccupied in the volume devoted to Along the Riverbank to material authenticity, but not to historical, conceptual, or scientific to the same extent. Yet the conceptual and contextual components of authenticity remain as important facets to the general appreciation of Chinese art. Material authenticity is what Denis Dutton had in mind in a philosophical context when he posed the question, authentic compared to what? It is a question that poses a direct challenge to us, particularly if we take the viewpoint that what we determine to be genuine or fake is not an objective determination, but one that we decide upon as a community. Dutton himself chose to distinguish between nominal authenticity and expressive authenticity. Nominal refers to the correct assignment of the original artist, while expressive authenticity relates to the original or inherent authority of the work, the sincerity and genuineness of expression that the work manifests. Because of the reverence for past achievements and their possible legitimated recreation, the authority invested in the intangible authenticity of restored or rebuilt monuments, the two modes proposed by Dutton are less successful in the Chinese context in helping us to move forward, and perhaps viewing the problems in terms of tangible, intangible, and historical or aesthetic authenticity could be more helpful. Does this brief account show that different communities may be involved in deciding what is or is not authentic in the East Asian setting? I think it does, because the local community has a voice in deciding how their own cultural materials are to be treated or valorized, while in the past it was only cultural heritage experts that would reach the decision that would be imposed upon the culture concerned. Because the past must be remade to remain relevant to ethnographic societies today, if I can use that term, the meanings associated with the temples or shrines may have changed substantially over the past few hundred years. If we think of authenticity as the problem child of the modern cult of the search for the real thing, then the consequence is that the use of the word is often avoided by contemporary scholars in the field of Western art history. Philosophers, yes, but others are often less brave. This is because of the contentious nature of authenticity and the myriad fields over which it operates. The desire for it has debased the context to a trope of little standing. Intangible cultural heritage has become increasingly recognized in China following the ratification of the Cultural Heritage Convention in August 2004. There is a tension between authenticity and cultural heritage, according to some commentators. I do not see that to be a fundamental problem. The whole point of intangible authenticity is that it is used as communities or in cultural settings, which are determinative factors, and these naturally alter with time as communities change or as the representation in the present is different from earlier diachronic conceptions of the work or monument. That is the point. It is a consensus that overrides the concern for material authenticity and is the principal raison d'etre of the Nara document on authenticity, which was crucially important for listing Japanese works of art. That may be true as a normative trope, but the different fields of authenticity hold a special resonance in ancient Chinese art. There has been considerable attention paid to the subject of authenticity in the Chinese context over the past 15 years or so, marking a salient difference from Western European art, where nervousness of engaging with the subject has resulted in an understandable reticence. In one sense, the topic cannot be avoided in the Chinese context because of the host of problems that beset the nature of origins and originality. Reverence for past artistic accomplishments of long dead masters have often resulted in emulations or appropriations, as we all know, in different contexts and time periods of Chinese art. I shall use Sino-Tibetan bronzes, shown here, currently being made in monasteries in Nepal and China, as a relevant example. These works carry every association, pose, and symbolism that authentic Ming originals would have possessed. Even for a skilled connoisseur or conservation scientist, it is practically impossible to tell the difference. In terms of aesthetic appeal and degree of craftsmanship, the recent productions and the originals cannot be differentiated. An example that negates Goodman's principle of the continuing impossibility of indiscernibility. The modern versions can only be differentiated from their predecessors by virtue of their elemental composition, since trace elements in the copper can be linked to a source in Mumbai, hardly a difference that an experienced eye would be able to discern. What have Western philosophers had to say concerning the construction of authenticity in Chinese art? Well, if we bypass Plato for the moment and read Mothersille, Hopkins, Sibley, Heidegger, Riegel, Benjamin, Danto, Goodman, Lopez, Curry, Sagoff, Zanwell, Hick, Linane, Wolheim, Korsmeyer, and a host of others, you'll see that the answer is essentially very little. Riegel's work is well known and describes the problem of art in terms of a series of values such as memory value, present-day value, age value, and historical value. The latter, for example, views the work as representative of a particular moment in history. Its emphasis is on documentary value and aims to keep the work in as close as possible to the original state, primarily through preventive conservation. An analysis of Chinese art in terms of these kinds of values sidesteps authenticity qua an evaluative judgment and replaces that with how a given work is valued and why. Other important contributions stem from Goodman, who framed the well-known distinction between the autographic and the allographic. From Davis comes the concepts of an epistemic instance of a work or a particular instance of the work, E or P instances. Being an E instance depends on what a work of art might look like, while a P instance depends on the context in which the work originates. Walton defines a series of categories of art which are worthy of attention, drawing a series of distinctions between standard and contra-standard features of different types of art. From Heidegger and Brandy, we derive the ideas of the evolution of authenticity over time, which copies lack. From Curry, Zangwell, and others, the distinction between artistic value and aesthetic value. Artistic value is that value that a work timelessly possesses qua a work of art, while aesthetic value is that which we accord to it in virtue of its being an artwork that we valorize. Thus, a copy of a work by Jin might have aesthetic value, but its artistic value would not be the same as if it was actually produced by Jin himself. Fashions have dictated that some original works with artistic value came to have little aesthetic value until their reputations were revived in the 20th century, even if some of these were imitations. Imitation of a work did not preclude adaptation to conform to the imagined past it represented or the cultural hegemony of the time it was actually produced in. Several philosophers mount a challenge to our liberal views of Chinese art authenticity. Mothersille held that aesthetic properties of a work can only be shared by works which are perceptually indistinguishable. Thus, stone engravings and ink squeezes from them, being perceptually distinguishable, would not qualify, while Sibley claimed that any given aesthetic property depends on a fully determinate non-aesthetic property. Hopkins tried to show that there were arguments which bypassed Sibley's concern, but not those of Mothersille. Wollheim thought that one's experiences of work are only valid insofar as they accord with the artist's retrievable intentions. Evidently, copies or later imitations cannot represent fully the intentions of the original artist and would be downgraded in Wollheim's philosophy, since they may not retrieve an original intentionality. Wimslet and Beardsley's intentional fallacy that I mentioned before relates to the concept that artists' intentions are neither available or desirable as modes of assessing artistic productions for the viewer today. This resulted in the two camps of the intentionalists and the anti-intentionalists. The latter held that mistaken justifications occur when the observer attributes certain kinds of interpretation to the mind of the artist. Intentionalists maintained that artists' personalities, intellectual approaches, psychological state, and creative attitude all affect the disposition of their created works. Hence, copies cannot fully represent an original intention, which in any case has personal, cultural, and moral authority that can only be conferred extrinsically on later copies of Chinese originals. Korsmeyer promoted the aesthetic of the transivity of touch that she maintains valorizes the real thing, not later copies, venerations, or appropriations, which lack the haptic properties of the original, even if later versions might be perceptually indistinguishable or highly valued. The opposing view is supported by Batin, Sartwell, and Elkins, all of whom see benefits in the aesthetic appreciation of copies of various kinds, though none of them deal with haptic qualities. Artists' intentions, the valorization of originals, the nature of an aesthetic interaction with an original, the aura of a work, are arguments against imitations or restored works of art as not possessing the same aesthetic value or artistic value of an original, all mount a challenge to much of what I've written here. Philosophers such as Sagoff would argue that a Song Dynasty copy of a Warring States original would be aesthetically without any merit, as he insists that when a valued experience is directed to a mistaken object, in this case something not from the Warring States, it introduces a macaronic element which is inappropriate and the result of a deception performed by the copyist. Korsmeyer writes that the sensory nature of touch, a much neglected aesthetic experience, demands contact with original, genuine works of art, which she regards as paramount. Here, it is genuineness that matters. However, we can argue that authenticity is capable of recognizing degrees or varieties of legitimacy, which does not necessarily imply an evaluative scale of genuineness, which is the implication of what Korsmeyer proposes. Even disregarding the lack of an exemplary veridical experience in the case of contemporary art replication, these descriptive terms of genuine and authentic are not synonymous. The appellation genuine that philosophers like Korsmeyer prefer seems either too presumptive or too definitive from the viewpoint of dealing with authenticity problems in Chinese art. Interestingly, Cortese, in his review of Korsmeyer's work, takes the opposite view and states that unlike authenticity, the designation of being genuine can accommodate a series of degrees of genuineness as a transitional elucidation of our regard for the real. There are two aspects here at least. Firstly, the homage to the Benjamin-derived concept of the aura of the work itself, seen as enhanced through the transivity of touch, as well as the concept of the value of touch itself for the observer, whether or not the work itself is marked as genuine or possesses a degree of genuineness. As an alternative approach to the reverence of materiality qua original substance, Heidegger, whose work is not much looked at, incorporates the diachronic effects of alteration and change in his account of the problem of authenticity, which he did not regard as an immutable property, but part of the ongoing dynamic life of the work of art. It is surprising then that his philosophy rarely seems to be mentioned in connection with the authenticity debates concerning cultural property, as he anticipated the importance of the intangible legitimated by the Nara document, and the notion that the life of the object, its authentic state of existence, is subject to change, as recent heritage protocols advocate or recognize. Heidegger, as well as Riegel and Brandy, viewed the art object as a being in time, as an historical entity, the conceptual and physical origins of which are important in the continuing life of the work, but equally important is the ongoing dynamic existence of the artwork, which is an essential feature of it, even if that results in major changes to the work itself. Excessive focus on the original state threatens the authenticity of the object in Heidegger's view, while attention to the ongoing life of the object and its alterations or changes over time furthers it. This puts the case for the interaction between authenticity and our appreciation and intentions regarding the artwork, not just the intentions of the artist herself, or possibly in conflict with them. It is the stakeholders who will decide what judgments they will make concerning the authenticity of the artwork in the present, leading us back to the performative, contested, and fragmented analysis that was mentioned at the beginning of this talk. The Chinese mirror chosen for the cover of this seminal volume on ancient Chinese bronze mirrors in the Lloyd Coateson collection is in fact a forgery. But some well-educated designer chose the mirror for aesthetic reasons to adorn the cover of this cloth-bound volume. It would be unusual to feature a forged Renaissance panel painting on the cover of a collection of Renaissance works, unless it was itself devoted to the subject of fakes and forgeries. The different rationale is connected to the problems of determining the material authenticity of ancient Chinese art and how much this might actually matter to us. Repetition and difference, as Deleuze writes, involves a series of mental events that creates in the mind a transitional set of appreciative evaluations depending on how we view the reception of the work. Mere simulacra, in Deleuzian terms, are copies without meaningful difference. Difference is the involvement of the mind in the recognition of significant repetitions, which would legitimate some later copies of earlier Chinese works. If we know, for example, that a copy of a Warring States mirror had been made by a Song dynasty connoisseur, while the other indiscernible copy had been made in the early 20th century, we can regard the former as a repetition of the work with real difference, as opposed to a simulacra exemplified by the later 20th century copy. Repetition and difference, ideas that go back to David Hume, are important concepts that deserve to be further explored in our philosophic examination of ancient Chinese art and its various shades of meaning, legitimacy, and difference, perhaps especially so because of the importance of copies in this debate. In a wider cultural context, many writers express the view that the meanings of authenticity emerge through how cultural heritage is experienced and negotiated in the nexus of interactions between people, places, and artifacts. These meanings are not simply embedded in the materiality of the work or culturally constructed values as an historical entity, and that is a view with increasing traction in the 21st century and a dimension of authenticity that can be enveloped into the conceptual. Different modes of appreciation of Chinese art, especially within a corpus which includes authentic ancient works, later dynastic versions of them, legitimated copies, admired fakes, emulations, modern recreations, or recent appropriations, are increasingly valued in themselves as reflections on the evolution of Chinese art and culture. The expansion of the field of authenticity to a more liberal understanding of what matters, rather than the positive, logical positive argument for a narrow interpretation, as a reflection of where we stand today. Even historic restorations, which would have been removed in earlier times, are now kept as significant statements of an authentic past. Digital and three-dimensional printing of Chinese art can be expected to produce a continuing debate concerning modes of production, visual discernibility, authenticity, and the legitimacy of copies into the future. Understanding the canon as a continuum of culturally important works helps us to realize the cult of authenticity in the present and how authenticities can be constructed and deconstructed to provide a rich tapestry of cultural and philosophical inquiry. Thank you for your attention.